Dust choked her lungs. Blood stained her rifle. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Lawson screamed into her radio, begging for air support, but the only answer was static and the deafening roar of enemy machine guns. Her SEAL team was going to die in this nameless valley. Until the sky cracked open. The intelligence had been classified, compartmentalized, and supposedly bulletproof. Operation Shattered Glass was designed to be a surgical strike, a textbook snatch and grab deep in the treacherous, sun-scorched ravines of the Al-Hajar mountain range. The target was a high-ranking facilitator for a unified insurgent network, a ghost who had finally made the mistake of lingering in one place for too long. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Lawson adjusted the strap of her plate carrier, the heavy ballistic plates digging familiarly into her collarbones. As one of the few women to earn the Trident and lead a Tier 1 element, Lawson had spent her career operating under a microscope. Every decision, every trigger pull, every tactical maneuver was scrutinized. But out here, in the unforgiving dirt, the only currency that mattered was survival. Her team, callsign Mako Axale, consisted of 3 other operators: Petty Officer First Class Dominic Vargas, a point man with eyes like a hawk; Lieutenant Chris Montgomery, a behemoth of a man carrying the Mk-48 machine gun; and Chief Jackson Cole, their communications and signals intelligence specialist. They were a well-oiled machine, having run dozens of successful direct-action raids together. The insertion had been flawless. Under the cover of a moonless night, the MH-60 Blackhawks had dropped them 3 miles from the target compound. They had hiked through the jagged, shale-covered terrain using their night vision goggles, moving like shadows against the rock. By dawn they were positioned in a dried-out wadi, a deep riverbed that offered defilade from the surrounding ridges, less than 200 meters from the objective. But as the first rays of the morning sun crested the eastern peaks, painting the barren valley in hues of violent orange and bruised purple, the suffocating silence of the desert was shattered. It started with a single sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls, followed instantly by the deafening hiss of a rocket-propelled grenade cutting through the dry air. "RPG, get down!" Lawson roared, tackling Vargas into the dirt just as the warhead slammed into the rocky outcropping they had been using for cover. The explosion threw them backwards, showering them in razor-sharp shrapnel and pulverized limestone. A shock wave rattled Lawson's teeth, and for a terrifying second, all she could hear was a high-pitched ringing. Before the dust could even begin to settle, the ridge lines above them erupted in muscle flashes. Heavy, sustained machine gun fire rained down into the wadi. Tracers crisscrossed the sky, forming a deadly glowing web over their heads. They had walked right into a fatal funnel. The enemy wasn't a ragtag group of unprepared militants. They were entrenched, organized, and waiting. Ambush, multiple shooters, high ground 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock. Montgomery bellowed, immediately rolling onto his stomach and deploying the bipod of his Mk-48. He squeezed the trigger, sending a deafening, cyclical wave of 7.62 millimeter rounds up toward the eastern ridge, desperately trying to buy them a fraction of a second to establish a defensive perimeter. "Vargas, Cole, status," Lawson shouted, pulling her M4A1 rifle to her shoulder and firing controlled bursts at the muzzle flashes above. "I'm good, boss," Cole yelled, scrambling behind a boulder, his backpack bristling with antennas. "Vargas!" Lawson turned her head. Dominic Vargas was slumped against the side of the trench, his hands clutching his upper right thigh. Dark, arterial blood was already pooling in the dust beneath him, turning the sand into dark crimson mud. A bullet had punched straight through the gap in his body armor. "Hit, I'm hit." Femoral. Vargas grunted, his face instantly draining of color as shock began to set in. "Ox, keep them suppressed. Cole, get on the horn." We need immediate extraction, Lawson commanded, her training taking over the primal surge of adrenaline. She scrambled on her hands and knees through the dirt, bullets snapping the air inches above her helmet until she reached Vargas. She ripped the tourniquet from her vest, sliding it high up on Vargas's leg, twisting the windlass with brutal force. Vargas let out a guttural scream, his hands gripping the rocks until his knuckles turned white. "I got you, Dom. Stay with me." "Look at me," Lawson ordered, securing the time strap. "Cole, where is my air support?" Chief Cole was furiously turning the dials on his radio, his face twisted in a mixture of frustration and rising panic. He swapped frequencies, tried the SATCOM, and even attempted to route a distress signal through a secondary encrypted channel. "Nothing," Cole shouted back over the roar of Montgomery's machine gun. "I'm pushing out the SOS and transmitting on all emergency bands, but I'm getting dead air." "It's not just jammed, Commander. The network is completely dark. Havot Base is not receiving." Lawson's blood ran cold. A complete communications blackout was statistically impossible unless their command element had intentionally gone dark, or the enemy had deployed military-grade electronic warfare assets that Intel had entirely missed. They were completely cut off. Above them, the enemy fire intensified. Lawson could hear the distinct, rhythmic thud of a Deist K-heavy machine gun joining the fray from the northern elevation. The large-caliber rounds began tearing chunks of rock the size of bowling balls off their meager cover. The informant hadn't been a target. He had been bait. And Mako Actual had swallowed the hook. "Consolidate ammo," Lawson yelled, pulling Vargas's rifle and spare magazines, tossing them to Cole. "We hold this trench. Nobody moves from this wadi." As the sun climbed higher, baking the valley floor into an oven, the reality of their situation settled over them like a shroud. They were 4 operators against an unknown number of heavily armed combatants, pinned at the bottom of a canyon with a critically wounded man, dwindling ammunition, and absolutely no one coming to save them. The SOS had been sent into the void, and the void had answered with silence. By midday, the wadi had become a sweltering tomb. The temperature soared past 110 degrees, the heat shimmering in waves off the jagged rocks, distorting the landscape and making it impossible to distinguish enemy movement from mirages. The initial ferocity of the ambush had settled into a brutal, agonizing siege. The enemy fighters on the ridges had realized they didn't need to rush the SEALs. They had the high ground, the numbers, and the time. They were content to bleed Mako Actual dry, firing harassing shots every few minutes to keep the Americans pinned in the dirt. Lawson wiped a mixture of sweat and dust from her eyes, her throat raw and parched. She lay prone next to Vargas, who was drifting in and out of consciousness. The tourniquet had stopped the massive arterial bleeding, but he had lost too much blood before she could apply it. His skin was cold and clammy, his lips tinged with a frightening shade of blue. "How are we doing on ammo, Ox?" Lawson asked, keeping her voice low, raspy from the dry air. Montgomery grunted, ejecting a spent belt from his MK-48. He looked exhausted, his face caked in black carbon and dirt. "I've got maybe 200 rounds left for the pig. 3 max for my secondary. If they decide to rush us all at once, I can hold them off for maybe 60 seconds. After that, it's going to be a knife fight in a phone booth." Lawson nodded grimly. "Cole, tell me you have something." Cole slammed his fist against the casing of his radio. "I've tried everything, boss. Line of sight, satellite bounce, emergency beacons. The spectrum is either flooded with white noise, or the relay drone that was supposed to be in our orbit has been redirected. We are ghosts." Lawson looked down at her rifle, the metal searing hot to the touch. She thought about the briefing room back at the base, Captain Wyatt's firm assurance that QRF was only 15 minutes out, that AC-130 gunships were on standby. Had the mission been compromised from the top, or had a larger geopolitical chess move suddenly made their survival an inconvenience? She shoved the dark thoughts aside. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Okay," Lawson said, her voice projecting a calm authority she didn't entirely feel. "We wait for nightfall. Once the sun drops, we carry Dom and we egress south through the ravine. We use the thermal crossover to mask our movement. We just have to hold out for 6 more hours." But the enemy commander had other plans. Around 1400 hours, the harassing fire suddenly stopped. An eerie, unnatural silence fell over the canyon. The wind whistled mournfully through the rocks, carrying the distinct metallic scent of hot brass and cordite. Lawson carefully raised her head, peering through the trichicon optic of her M4. Through the magnified glass, she saw movement on the northern ridge. The fighters were no longer hiding behind cover. They were standing up. A man in a tactical chest rig and a dark keffiyeh stepped out onto a prominent ledge, looking down into the wadi. He raised a radio to his mouth, spoke into it, and then dropped his arm in a sweeping forward motion. "Movement," Montgomery hissed, his finger hovering over the trigger. "They're bounding down the slopes, 3 sides. They're trying to flank us." Lawson tracked the advancing figures. There were dozens of them, moving with coordinated military precision. This wasn't a blind rush, it was a tactical envelopment. They were using the natural folds in the rock to close the distance, minimizing their exposure to Montgomery's machine gun. "They know we're low on ammo," Cole said, drawing his sidearm, his voice tight. "They're coming to finish it. Fix bayonets if you have them." "Draw secondary weapons," Lawson ordered, her tone chillingly calm. She checked the chamber of her rifle, ensuring a round was seated. She looked at Vargas, who had opened his eyes, weakly gripping his pistol. "Nobody gets taken alive. Make them pay for every inch of this dirt." The enemy forces were within 75 meters now. Lawson could see the whites of their eyes, the intricate patterns on their scarves, the gleam of their bayonets. She exhaled slowly, centering the reticle of her optic on the chest of the lead fighter. "On my mark," Lawson whispered. The man in the keffiyeh on the ridge raised an AK-47 into the air, opening his mouth to shout the final order to charge. Before the sound could leave his throat, his chest violently exploded outward in a mist of red. A split second later, a thunderous echoing crack rolled across the valley, a sound so deep and concussive it seemed to vibrate the very marrow in Lawson's bones. It wasn't the sharp snap of an M4 or the rapid stutter of an AK. It was the heavy booming report of a massive, high-velocity sniper rifle. The enemy commander crumpled, falling forward off the ledge and tumbling down the rocky slope like a discarded rag doll. The advancing enemy fighters froze, shock paralyzing them. They looked up at the ridge, then wildly around the canyon, trying to locate the source of the shot. Before they could react, a second scrap tore through the air. The DSHK machine gunner, who had been setting up on a rocky precipice to provide covering fire for the assault, was violently thrown backward, his helmet flying off as an invisible sledgehammer struck him in the head. "What the hell was that?" Montgomery yelled, lowering his weapon in pure confusion. "Sniper!" Cole shouted, frantically scanning the surrounding peaks. But from where, and whose? A third shot rang out. A heavy metallic ping echoed through the canyon, as a massive round completely obliterated the engine block of an enemy technical truck parked on the far ridge, sending a shower of sparks and boiling oil over the insurgents behind it. The enemy assault completely fractured, panic replaced precision. The insurgents, suddenly realizing they were being hunted by an unseen predator who could reach out and touch them from impossible distances, abandoned their push. They scrambled the cover, diving behind rocks and screaming into their radios. Lawson pulled her eye away from her optic, her heart hammering against her ribs. She scanned the distant eastern ridgeline, the highest peak in the valley, sitting almost 1,000 yards away. There was nothing but jagged, sun-baked rock. "Boss," Cole said, his voice trembling slightly. "I thought you said we were alone out here." "We are," Lawson breathed, her eyes locked on the distant peak. The shot had come from an elevation of at least 2,000 feet, from a distance that required an absolute master of ballistics, windage, and elevation. It was a shot that only a Tier 1 sniper could make. But Meko Actual had no sniper attached to this op. There were no friendly forces within 100 miles. Another thunderous crack echoed off the canyon walls. Another enemy fighter dropped instantly. The phantom shooter was systematically, ruthlessly dismantling the ambush. Lawson didn't know who was up on that ridge. She didn't know if they were a guardian angel, a rogue element, or a ghost from a past deployment. All she knew was that the impossible had just happened. The silence on the radio had been broken, not by words, but by the devastating roar of a .338 Lapua Magnum, and whoever was pulling the trigger had just bought them a second chance at life. For 5 agonizingly long minutes, the only sounds in the valley were the erratic, shallow breathing of Dominic Vargas and the terrified shouts of the surviving insurgents echoing off the canyon walls. They were scrambling, dragging their dead, terrified of the invisible executioner perched somewhere in the stratosphere. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Lawson didn't waste the miracle she had just been handed. "Ox, Cole, remove right now," Lawson barked, her voice cutting through the ringing in their ears. "We use this chaos, grab Dom. We're falling back to the secondary rally point at the mouth of the ravine." Lieutenant Montgomery, fueled by a massive dump of adrenaline, slung his heavy machine gun over his back. He reached down, grabbed the drag handle on the back of Vargas' plate carrier, and hoisted the wounded operator over his broad shoulders in a grueling fireman's carry. Vargas groaned in agony, his blood dripping down Montgomery's back, but the big man didn't falter. As they began to tactical crawl their way backward through the serpentine trench of the wadi, a sudden sharp burst of static hissed through Lawson's earpiece. It wasn't the dead air from before. It was a localized, encrypted channel breaking through the jamming net. "Mako Actual, this is Reaper 01. Keep your heads down and adjust your heading to 045. You have 3 tangos maneuvering through the shale on your blind side." The voice was female. It was chillingly calm, devoid of panic, the cadence steady and deliberate. The voice of someone whose resting heart rate was sitting at a cool 60 beats per minute while surrounded by a war zone. Lawson froze, pressing 2 fingers to her headset. "Reaper 01, this is Mako Actual. Identify yourself. Are you QRF?" A dark, humorous chuckle vibrated through the earpiece. "Not quite, Commander Lawson. My name is Senior Chief Valerie Kessler. Naval Special Warfare, currently attached to CIA Special Activities Center. And right now, and the only reason your team isn't bleeding out in that dirt. Stop talking and move. I have your 6, Valerie Kessler." Lawson's mind raced. The name was a phantom in the special operations community. Rumors had floated for years about a highly classified, off-the-books initiative that had quietly pushed a select few women through the grueling SEAL sniper qualification course, operating under completely black, unacknowledged protocols. Kessler was supposedly a ghost, a myth traded in hushed whispers in the dive bars of Virginia Beach. But the thunderous roar of the .338 Lapua Magnum echoing across the valley was violently, undeniably real. Before Lawson could process the revelation, Kessler's voice returned. "Target reference point, broken limestone pillar 200 meters to your right. Watch the magic. Lawson snapped her head toward the pillar. 3 insurgents, armed with AK-47s, were silently creeping down the shale, attempting to flank the SEAL's retreating path. 2 seconds later, the lead insurgent's chest caved in. A split second after that, the deafening crack of the rifle rolled over them. The heavy, armor-piercing round had traveled over 1,000 yards, dropping the fighter instantly. The remaining 2 insurgents panicked, breaking cover and running blindly. Crack. The second man dropped, his leg violently sheared out from under him. Crack. The third man fell face first into the dirt, motionless. 3 shots, 3 impacts. Absolute terrifying precision. Path is clear, Marco. Pick up the pace, Kessler said, her voice betraying the slight exertion of working the rifle's heavy bolt. Kessler, what the hell is going on? Lawson demanded, keeping her rifle raised as she covered Montgomery and Cole moving through the ravine. Our comms are jammed, our QRF is a no-show, and we walked into a brigade-sized ambush. Were we compromised? Silence lingered on the radio for a few heavy seconds. When Kessler finally spoke, the chilling truth froze the sweat on Lawson's neck. You weren't compromised, Commander. You were exactly where you were supposed to be. Operation Shattered Glass wasn't a snatch and grab. The low-level facilitator you were sent to capture was a decoy. What are you saying? Lawson hissed, her grip tightening on her rifle until her knuckles ached. The real target was the unified insurgent commander, a ghost named Tariq, Kessler explained coolly. Intelligence tracked him to this valley, but he never leaves his fortified tunnel network. He's a coward. The only way to draw him out into the open was to present him with an irresistible prize. A Tier 1 SEAL team, pinned down and vulnerable. The reality of the betrayal hit Lawson like a physical blow. The missing air support, the delayed QRF, the perfect deadly funnel they had been dropped into. It was all by design. Havoc Base had known exactly what was waiting in this valley. Marco Actual wasn't the hunter on this mission. They were the bait. You used my men, Lawson whispered, a cold, blinding fury replacing her fear. You put my team in a meat grinder just to get a clear shot at one man. I didn't write the op order, Lawson, Kessler replied, a hint of steel entering her tone. I'm just the asset they placed on the mountain to pull the trigger. Tariq is dead. The head of the snake is severed. The body is still thrashing. Now focus. I've deployed a localized broadband disruptor. It's overriding their jamming equipment. You have comms with me, and I have comms with the birds. Medevac is inbound. ETA 15 mics. Do you want to argue military ethics, or do you want your boy Vargas to live? Lawson looked back at Vargas. His face was the color of ash. Time was running out. Guide us out, Reaper, Lawson ordered, swallowing her rage. We survive first, she told herself. We settle the score later. The sun finally dipped behind the western peaks, plunging the Al-Hajar Valley into a deep, bruised twilight. The sudden drop in temperature was immediate, the scorching oven of the day giving way to the freezing, biting wind of the desert night. With a singerized flick, the remaining 3 SEALs dropped their 4-tube night vision goggles over their eyes. The world shifted into a hyper-detailed, luminescent green. Through the phosphor tubes, the heat signatures of the recently deceased insurgents glowed brightly against the cooling rocks. We're at the rally point, Lawson whispered into her radio, taking a knee behind a massive boulder. Montgomery gently lowered Vargas to the ground. The wounded SEAL was barely breathing, his pulse thready and weak. Cole immediately went to work, packing Vargas wound with fresh hemostatic gauze, his hands slick with his teammates' blood. Copy, Marco, Kessler's voice crackled. I have you on thermal. The landing zone is a flat plateau 50 meters north of your position. The Night Stalkers are pushing maximum torque. They'll be on top of you in 2 minutes. Understood, Lawson said. "What about the remaining hostiles?" "They're disorganized, but they're not stupid," Kessler replied. "They know the helicopters are coming. I'm tracking 2 technical trucks armed with heavy machine guns moving up the southern switchback. They're going to try and shoot down your ride. I need to displace to get an angle on them." "You're shifting position. You'll lose your camouflage," Lawson warned. "Don't worry about me, Commander. Just get your boys on that bird." In the distance, the heavy, rhythmic thwack-whack-thwack of rotor blades began to reverberate through the canyon. An MH-47 Chinook, painted completely black and flying without anti-collision lights, came tearing over the ridgeline. It flared hard, its twin rotors kicking up a blinding maelstrom of dust, sand, and loose rocks as it descended toward the plateau. "Go, go, go!" Lawson screamed over the deafening roar of the engines. Montgomery hauled Vargas back up, sprinting toward the lowered rear ramp of the Chinook. Cole was right beside him, providing covering fire into the darkness. Suddenly, the valley lit up. From the southern switchback, a stream of green tracer rounds erupted from an insurgent technical truck, the heavy DHK machine gun tearing through the air, blindly searching for the helicopter in the dust cloud. "They're firing blind, but they're getting close," Cole yelled, ducking as a round shattered a rock near his head. Lawson raised her rifle, but the truck was out of effective range for her 5.56mm weapon. High above them on the eastern ridge, a new muzzle flash erupted in the darkness. It was immediately followed by the booming report of Kessler's sniper rifle. The heavy bullet found its mark. Sparks showered the night as the round struck the Technical's ammunition box. A massive secondary explosion ripped through the canyon, turning the insurgent truck into a brilliant, blooming fireball of orange and yellow. The machine gun went dead. "Nice shooting, Reba," Lawson breathed. "Your ride is waiting, Mako. Get out of here," Kessler replied. There was a finality in her voice, a sudden metallic click as she closed her radio channel. Lawson backed up the ramp of the Chinook, her rifle raised, scanning the darkness one last time. As the helicopter lifted off, the G-force pushing her heavy into the deck, she looked toward the highest peak. Through her night vision, she thought she saw a faint, momentary glint, the reflection of moonlight off a scope lens. And then nothing but the empty, sprawling expanse of the mountains. The ghost had vanished. 30 hours later, Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Lawson stood in a sterile, soundproof SHIF, deeply buried beneath a secure naval facility in Bahrain. She wore her dress uniform, her face bruised, her hands still stained with the faint, stubborn residue of dirt and cordite. Across the polished mahogany table sat a vice admiral and 2 men in immaculate charcoal suits who carried no identification. "Dominic Vargas is in stable condition at Landstuhl," the admiral said, his voice flat. "He'll keep his leg, but his time as an operator is over." "You brought your men home, Commander Lawson." It was a textbook exfiltration under extreme duress. "It was a setup," Lawson said, her voice shaking with a cold, contained fury. She didn't blink, locking eyes with the admiral. "We were sacrificed to draw out Tariq. We had no QRF. We had no air support. You sent us in to die." One of the men in the suits leaned forward, his expression impassive. "Operation Shattered Glass was a resounding success, Commander. A high-value target responsible for the deaths of dozens of coalition forces has been eliminated. The operational details, including the tactical diversion employed, classified above your clearance. This mission never happened. The ambush never happened." Lawson slammed her hands onto the table. "And what about the sniper? What about Senior Chief Kessler?" The men in the suits exchanged a brief, unreadable glance. The admiral sighed, folding his hands. "Commander," the admiral said quietly, "there is no record of a Senior Chief Valerie Kessler in naval special warfare. The CORA does not comment on its special activities operations. As far as the official record is concerned, Marco Actual repelled the ambush through superior firepower and tactical maneuvering. You were alone in that valley. Lawson stared at them, the suffocating reality of the shadow wall washing over her. The truth was buried in classified servers, sanitized by men who had never smelled blood in the sand. But she knew the truth. She knew the terrifying, awe-inspiring guardian angel who had watched over them from the dark peaks. She stood up, executing a crisp, rigid salute, her eyes burning with defiance. "Understood, sir," Lawson said softly. "We were alone." As she walked out of the briefing room and into the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway, Lawson knew she would carry the scars of that valley forever. But she also carried a profound, silent respect. Somewhere out there, in the darkest, most dangerous corners of the world, women like Valerie Kessler were pulling the trigger, bearing the weight of impossible sins, and ensuring that those left behind in the dirt lived to fight another day. They were the ghosts of the Shadow War, and they never missed. Did this intense real-life tale of betrayal, survival, and the silent heroics of a Shadow Ops sniper keep you on the edge of your seat? The true stories of our elite operators are often wilder than fiction. Hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who love military thrillers, and subscribe for more gripping, heart-pounding combat stories. Drop a comment below. Would you have kept Kessler's secret?